Okay, I'm back, and I've got a few minutes to try to make this video. I often have tried to bring up my pain in relationships, and sometimes those relationship discussions end up getting into more pain, meaning we get into a fight or an argument or like whatever. It doesn't matter. What happens in a fight is that you don't feel seen, you don't feel heard, you don't feel understood, which is the definition of trauma according to Bessel van der Kolk. There's many definitions out there, but they kind of all distill down into that. And what he said was, when you don't feel seen or known is trauma. So when I don't feel seen and I don't feel known, I don't feel understood, then I don't feel like you see me and I don't feel like you hear me. And that obviously causes a bigger disconnect. And what's the one thing we all want in our relationships, at least what I want in my relationships, is more connection. So at the beginning of the year, I did that thing where you figure out, like, this is going to be my New Year's resolution. But for me, it wasn't like going to the gym, even though I should have done that. It was more about, well, there's that thing. I'm sure there's a name for it. I don't know what it is, but it's like where you choose a word and this is going to be your word for the year. So I couldn't figure out a word and I ended up choosing a phrase. Here's the phrase: emotional intelligence creates more emotional connection. That implies that I needed to and was going to focus on emotional intelligence. And now, 10 months later, it's the beginning of October, I feel like I can actually speak to what emotional intelligence really is. I took some incredible courses from the National Association of Clinical Behavior. Um, I also took some coaching classes and ran a bunch of retreats and tested out a bunch of things in my own life. Here's what I arrived at. One, when I try to bring up my pain, and every relationship has pain. Tell me a relationship or show me one of your relationships that doesn't have emotional pain in it somewhere. And emotional pain is like just a simple rupture, right? It doesn't have to be really big. It's just a rupture. So I started thinking about, like, what's that thing that every human being goes through? And the thing that every human being goes through or has an experience with is a relationship. And then I thought, well, what's the one thing that every relationship has? And the one thing that every relationship has is rupture. So then I want this relationship and this relationship is going to have rupture. Then typically it's fair to say every ruptured relationship desires one thing, and that is that the rupture never happened. Well, that's impossible. So the next thing that I could hope for or desire is to repair the rupture that happened in the relationship. If this logic is true, then what it means to my brain is that there is a formula for repairing relationships. So I started looking at where my ruptures were taking place in my relationships. And as I dove deeper into those, what I noticed was that when I would bring up my pain, it would create defensiveness because the person that I'd be bringing up my pain with, I'd be talking about their behavior. And of course, they wanted to defend their behavior. So because they want to defend their behavior, they can't admit. And I noticed that there was two things that would happen. One, I bring up my pain by talking about your behavior, the thing you did that caused me pain. And now you're either forced to admit or defend, or a mixture. Either way, if you admit, yeah, I screwed up and I can see how that was really bad and really painful, well, that's essentially behavior modification. And there is a place for behavior modification. We all need to modify our behaviors, especially when they're causing pain in other people's lives. But most of the things that we do are subconscious. In fact, the data shows that 95% of all of our behaviors come from subconscious beliefs that we carry, meaning I don't even have an awareness of this belief that I have, which is driving the behavior, which I'm not even awakened to or I'm blind to it. And so then how do I modify behavior that I don't even really know that I'm doing or why I'm doing it. I'm not even aware. Well, that typically has come in the past. Like these come from because we create pain in other people's lives and they bring it up. And then we go, oh, sorry. And here's the question. Have you ever been in a relationship where you feel like the guys go through this a lot? At least I used to go through. It's like, just tell me what you want me to do. That's behavior modification. That's also coming from the subconscious beliefs, 95% of them, that I have that I don't even know why I'm doing what I'm doing. I think this is what is meant when the old ancient stories, like the Adam and Eve story, says, Adam, awake. It's like awaken, like everyone must wake up to the behaviors that they're unaware, that are coming from the beliefs that they're asleep to, that like they don't even know that they have these beliefs. So, are you following me on that? Should we be drawing this out on a whiteboard? I think you're following. The point, if you have questions, I don't know, make a comment or send me a DM. So there's all of that that's going on, right? This is really basic, simple stuff. But what is also really basic and simple is improving and increasing emotional connection, which comes from emotional intelligence. Here's how I think it works. Our relationship has a rupture, and in that rupture, I feel, let's say I feel abandoned. And maybe it might be even a little bit more, what's the word? Obtruse than that. Maybe I don't really feel abandoned, but I don't feel chosen. Maybe I don't really feel prioritized, right? So it could be, you get the picture. It's something like that. And so I come to you and I talk about, I have this pain, this emotional pain from feeling abandoned or feeling not prioritized, not chosen. Maybe you made a joke in front of other people and it hurt my feelings and I kind of played it off like it wasn't really a big thing. But then the ride home is kind of silent and awkward. You've probably been there. So now I need to talk about my pain because my pain needs to get witnessed. My emotions have a message for me about this situation and about my relationship. I love Gabor Mate's definition of why we, or his explanation of why we have emotions. He says we have emotions because all of our emotions are there as messengers to help instruct us on what relationships we should allow into our life. So think about sadness, anger, fear, disgust. Those emotions are actually trying to give you a message about your relationship and how to improve it so that that relationship can come closer into your life. In other words, have emotional connection. And there's a formula to make that happen. And if you don't follow the formula, well, then the rupture is going to cause the relationship to separate and maybe never repair, which is a painful thing for all of us. No one gets into a relationship where we think this is going to rupture and never repair, and that's going to be a good thing, right? No, nobody says that. We feel like, I felt like in times like that was so good that I got away from that relationship. And I'm sure people have thought that about me. However, the point is that if we understand this formula and how to bring up pain without talking about your behavior. So if you made a joke at the party and it hurt my feelings and we're driving home together and I say, hey, don't make jokes about me. See, now I'm talking about your behavior. But what am I actually really trying to do? Am I really trying to modify your behavior? Why don't you modify your behavior? Why don't you like that's you. I don't know if I need to speak to that. So this is kind of a little bit backwards thinking, but it's very simple. So stick with me for a second. I don't need to modify your behavior. What I do need to do is talk about my emotions. And what I can say is tonight at the event or at the party that we were at, I felt very sad. In fact, I felt pretty low. And that was painful for me. I had a pretty painful experience. It really, honestly, I felt not chosen. I felt abandoned. I felt I felt like the I felt rejected. See, in this, I'm now speaking all about my feelings and all about my pain and all about where I'm at. Now, if you were saying that to me, what I would say to you is that must be very difficult. When did you start feeling that? And I would say, I felt that when we were sitting on the couch outside by the fire. You know, when Billy was lighting off the firecrackers and being crazy. Yeah, it started about right then. And I would then say to you, do you feel like I have a role to play in the way that you felt? And you would say, yes, I do feel like you have a role to play. Now, here's where it's really simple. I then would say to you, let me think about what I did. Let me think about my behaviors that might have contributed to you feeling the way you just described. And then I would sit and think, and then I would say to myself, oh, I made that one joke. And I bet you that didn't go over very well. I kind of saw how you squirmed a little bit, and I knew it didn't land, and I didn't correct it, and I felt embarrassed by it. But I think that something that I could have done in that time that would have contributed to you feeling that way was that joke that I said. And even though I didn't mean it to be hurtful to you, I think if I was you, that's exactly how I would have felt, because I didn't deliver that very well. And also, it kind of was done at your expense, to be honest. I've been a little frustrated. I have felt a little bit of pain, and that was a really immature way for me to take that out on you. And I apologize, but I think that's like a thing that I think would have happened, that I contributed to your pain. And you would then say, yep, that's what happened. So I brought up my pain without talking about your behavior, and I now know that I'm in a good, healthy relationship because you just accounted for your behavior. You accounted for your behavior. In other words, let me account for my behavior. Don't account for it. Don't speak to my behavior without giving me a chance first to speak to it myself. It's my behavior. I want to account for it. Rather than you speak to it and now I have to admit it. Admittability is not accountability. I've done some stories about this, but here's my basic thoughts on it. Accountability is really simple. Accountability is my ability to account for my role in the situation without finding fault in you, myself, or anyone involved. Accountability is like an Excel spreadsheet. There's no blame, there's no shame, there's no victimhood, there's no need for evidence. It just is what it is. And accountability cannot happen unless there's authenticity. So in the example you heard me speaking, and like as if I was the person that had hurt you and offended you. Well, did you hear how authentic I was? I was very truthful to why I did it. I owned it, and I spoke to I was upset and I'm carrying some feelings, and I was also very immature in doing that. That's authenticity. So the question isn't really about accountability. The question is, how come you can't be authentic in the relationship? And I believe that it's because it's really scary to be vulnerable. In the ancient Greek word, like the ancient Greek language, the word for vulnerability means a willingness to be hurt or a willingness to be wounded. And so I don't really want to be vulnerable because I'm going to sound like a complete ass and admit, right, my truth of why I did what I did. And then that might hurt your feelings even a little bit more. But authenticity is really the only way to get to emotional connection. So here's how you get authenticity, vulnerability, and accountability, because I don't think you can separate those three from each other. I have to promise in the relationship really clearly that I will not weaponize your vulnerabilities. If I will weaponize your vulnerability, then you will shut down your willingness to be vulnerable. So it's actually about vulnerability and not weaponizing it. A toxic relationship weaponizes your vulnerability, which makes it very difficult to account for things because I am going to get blamed for it. Well, what was the big issue with the Adam and Eve story? When God comes walking through the garden, what does he say? Adam, where goest thou? Is one interpretation. Another one is, where art thou? So, Adam, where are you? Well, he's hiding. And Jordan Peterson says hiding means vulnerability. He was covering up his vulnerabilities, trying to hide the shit that he had done and the behaviors that he had done because no one wants to own that. So God says, come out, show yourselves, and also it's okay to be vulnerable. But what happened? Tell me the story. And what's the first thing Adam does? He blames. And he blames two people. The woman you gave me, so he blames God. And then he blames Eve. She made me take the fruit. Well, in the really watered down version of it, then Eve now has to account for it. And what does she do? Well, she just kicks the can down the road and blames Lucifer or the serpent and says, the serpent beguiled me. It's his fault. See, vulnerability is really hard because it's really hard to not weaponize someone's vulnerability. The thing that makes your relationship safe is that one promise. I will not weaponize your vulnerability. If you won't weaponize the vulnerability and you'll keep that promise, you'll increase accountability and you'll increase authenticity. And those will then bring closer emotional connection. I hope that makes sense, and I hope it was fairly simple.